In the year 415 BC, 16 years into the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta and their allies, an armada of over 130 Athenian triremes sailed westwards from Greece to Sicily, an island which had been heavily colonized by the Greek city-states over the past several hundred years. With 5,000 hoplites, the elite citizen soldiers of the Greek city-states, on board, and thousands of other mariners and auxiliaries, the Armada was an enormous undertaking for Athens and her allies. But the expedition was a huge risk too. On it would hinge whether the Athenians would emerge victorious against the Spartans or risk catastrophic defeat in the wider Peloponnesian War. And one man above all was responsible for this risky venture. His name was Alcibiades, a rising political figure in Athens, and someone who has been identified as the epitome of an ancient demagogue, someone who rose swiftly to power through a populist platform and then fell back to earth again just as quickly. This is the tale of an Athenian demagogue. Alcibiades is one of the few figures from Athenian political history during the classical period of Greek history, that is, the era running roughly from 600 BC to 370 BC, about whose life we have considerable information. This is because he was the subject of one of the biographies of the eminent Greeks and Romans, written by the 2nd century AD Greco-Roman historical biographer Plutarch. His Life of Alcibiades is by far and away the foremost source for his life. However, we also have extensive details about his role in the Peloponnesian War from the history of the same war written by one of the great fathers of history as a discipline, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War is a major repository of knowledge about the Sicilian expedition. Another contemporary of Alcibiades, Xenophon, an essayist, historian and one of the pupils of Socrates, is our most detailed informant concerning the final years of the war and Alcibiades' role in it, as Thucydides died before he could finish his own book. Finally, Alcibiades features in several of the philosopher Plato's dialogues on Socrates, while somewhat inevitably, given his centrality to Athenian politics in the 410s BC and 400s BC, Alcibiades was also a character or discussed in some of the plays of the leading Athenian playwrights of the era, Euripides, Sophocles, and Aristophanes. Alcibiades hailed from a prominent aristocratic family within Athens. Although Athens was a democracy, it had only become one in the late 6th century BC and still had a powerful aristocratic class. His family had ties to Sparta and friendly relations with many there, a legacy of the Persian invasions of Greece back in the early 5th century BC, when the Greek states had allied with each other against this foreign interloper. Thus, Alcibiades, when he was born in Athens around 450 BC, was given a name which was Spartan in origin, not Athenian. He grew up as a promising young man, but a difficult one who was smart and energetic, but also impulsive and overly ambitious. By his teenage years, he was part of the circle of aristocratic young men who were pupils and acolytes of the philosopher Socrates, which included Plato and Xenophon. He married Hipparete, the daughter of a very wealthy Athenian by the name of Hipponicus. Hence Alcibiades came from privilege and, as we will see, carried it around with him. Alcibiades' adult life was lived entirely in the shadow of the rivalry between Athens and Sparta and the near 3 decades-long war fought between them from 431 BC to 404 BC. The Greek world during the classical period was divided into hundreds of poleis or city-states that controlled small patches of territory on mainland Greece, the Greek islands, and elsewhere around the Mediterranean, with many city-states having established colonies as far afield as the Black Sea, western Turkey, Sicily, North Africa, and even places like Marseille in southern France. Sparta was unique amongst these in being a society geared entirely towards military activity, and not trade or commerce, instead dominating their neighbours, who were turned into helots, a species of semi-slaves who carried out all the labour and agricultural work they needed. As a result, they had become the foremost Greek power in the Peloponnese in the 6th century BC, head of an alliance that included many of the mainland Greek poleis. However, in the early 5th century, owing to 2 unsuccessful separate invasions of Greece by the Persian Empire, Athens had emerged as a major naval power with a large fleet. It then began building its own alliance in the middle of the 5th century BC, known as the Delian League, and soon came to dominate the hundreds of islands which dotted the Aegean Sea. As this occurred, a cold war between Athens and Sparta began for dominance of the Greek world. It eventually boiled over as a result of a localized dispute on the island of Corcyra in the late 430s BC, where there was a pro-Corinthian and a pro-Athenian faction, Corinth being an ally of Sparta. The dispute escalated, leading to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. It would last for 27 years. The war would take the shape of Sparta and its allies invading the Attica region of Greece every year to lay siege to the city of Athens. However, Athens had become the foremost city in the Greek world by then and had great walls built around it, as well as long walls connecting it to its port at Piraeus. What this meant was that the Athenians could outlast the Spartans in any war as long as they displayed caution and didn't risk its resources. If it did so, it would be able to continue bringing goods in by ship to the Piraeus and keep Athens supplied from abroad, and eventually Sparta and its allies would simply give up. Alcibiades, who was only around 20 years old when the war began, would do more than any other figure to destroy this cautious policy. In the early stages of the Peloponnesian War, Alcibiades was a young man with no public status, and the Athenian state was dominated by the elder statesman Pericles. However, he died early on in the conflict, leaving a vacuum for ambitious political figures to rise to prominence. One figure who became the de facto successor to Pericles over time was Nicias, along with his rival Cleon, both figures who had played an extensive role in the politics of Athens, as it was cementing control over its great naval empire in the 440s and 430s BC. Alcibiades consequently had to be content with working his way up the political ladder in Athens in the 420s BC by fighting in numerous military campaigns. There were clashes underway all around the eastern Mediterranean as part of the war with Sparta, often only involving a few hundred hoplites here and there, and the allied troops of the 2 city-states. He fought in some of these campaigns, but in truth Alcibiades' rise largely came about by exploiting the debate over the Peace of Nicias. In 421 BC, Nicias oversaw the agreement of a truce with the Spartans and aimed to establish a lasting peace. This was resisted by many figures in Athens. Alcibiades was amongst them and did his utmost to gain politically from the debate over the peace. He managed to do so extremely effectively, and by the 410s BC, he was one of the foremost political figures in the city, a rival to Nicias for leadership of the state. While the early 410s BC and the political unrest over the war with Sparta had allowed for Alcibiades to emerge as a political figure of some note in the city, he perceived that in order to become paramount and succeed Pericles as the de facto head of the Athenian state, he needed to achieve some great victory in the war with Sparta. Hence it was that in 416 BC he began pressing the case in meetings of the Athenian Ecclesia, the assembly of the city's politicians and citizens, for Athens to launch a very ambitious expedition to Sicily and to conquer the Greek colonies there, the most powerful of which, the city of Syracuse, was sympathetic to the Spartan alliance. If this was achieved, it would allow Athens to continue supplying itself for many years to come with grain from Sicily, and it would acquire new allies in Italy with whom it could defeat Sparta. A major debate followed on this in Athens, with many people pointing out that this idea would fundamentally go against the cautious, conservative strategy that Pericles had favoured when he was alive. But a majority of the Athenians were won over by Alcibiades' arguments. Yet there was a catch. Wary of the young demagogue's ambitions, it was stipulated that Nicias would be appointed to lead the expedition, not Alcibiades himself. Doubling down on the project, Nicias then convinced the ecclesia to make the planned expedition even bigger in order to ensure success that he could then claim the credit for. And so we return to where we began, with the Armada sailing across the Mediterranean to the great Italian island in 415 BC. It met with some initial successes and captured some territory and allies, but thereafter, when it moved to try and conquer Syracuse, it began to turn into a disaster. The initial Armada failed to take the city, and then Athens sent another massive resupply force. These then ended up being cut off from resupply and were surrounded near Syracuse. Their position was laid siege to until, starving and dehydrated, they surrendered in large numbers to the Syracusans. Nicias was killed following the defeat. It spelled disaster for Athens, which now did not have the resources necessary to fight the war effectively against Sparta. However, Alcibiades didn't have to face the repercussions of his actions. He had already abandoned his home city. Back in 415 BC, right before the Armada sailed to Sicily, Alcibiades had been accused in Athens of taking part in an obscene gathering in which the gods were profaned. Despite his desire for a trial before leaving for Italy, none was forthcoming. Instead, he was condemned in absentia. What he did then was amazing in some respects, though hardly unexpected given his family's past relations with the Spartans. While in Sicily, he defected to Sparta, heading to the Peloponnese in Greece and beginning to advise Athens' enemy on how they could best prosecute the war against his homeland. The Athenians responding by condemning him to death, should he ever try to return home. In Sparta, he soon proved himself quite useful to the Spartans, taking part in an expedition to the Aegean Sea, where he convinced some of Athens' allies in the islands there to switch sides to Sparta. By the late 410s BC, Alcibiades' fortunes were shifting. A change in political circumstances in Sparta, a peculiar state which was governed by a mix of senior magistrates and two different kings who ruled simultaneously, led to his waning popularity there, while there were rumblings back in Athens that Alcibiades was needed to try to restore Athens' plummeting fortunes in the war. He was proving himself to be an able commander for Sparta, and the Athenians perceived it would be best to neutralize him by pardoning him and bringing him home than to have him as their enemy. Thus it was that one of the most peculiar political resurrections of the ancient world occurred. Alcibiades returned home to Athens in 411 BC after being assured, through intermediaries, that he would not be punished for his multiple wrongdoings. Attendant on this was a series of revolutions in Athens whereby the democracy was overthrown by an oligarchic system known as the 400, replaced later by the 5000. Back in Athens, Alcibiades soon managed to win victories of a kind which he never had back before the Sicilian expedition. Despite Athens' precarious position at this point in the war, he led a fleet against the Spartans in 410 BC and won a substantial victory at Cyzicus off the coast of Anatolia in what is now western Turkey. Over the next few years, he established himself as the leading Athenian naval commander, operating with a fleet of triremes in the Aegean and basing himself out of the island of Samos. The idea here was to simply survive by continuing to keep Athens supplied with the much-reduced fleet and armies available after the Sicilian disaster, following which Sparta and her allies had determined to try and match Athens' naval power and blockade the city both by sea and land. Alcibiades may have been responsible for the Sicilian expedition, but during these years he succeeded in doing much to help Athens survive as well. That is until 406 BC, when he suffered a crushing defeat against the Spartans at the Battle of Notium, again off the coast of Anatolia. Here his decision to leave a junior commander, Antiochus, in charge while he went to see to the Athenian forces nearby was viewed poorly, and it was clear to Alcibiades after the defeat that he would not be received kindly if he returned to Athens again. Fearing for his life, he headed to the mainland of Anatolia and sought refuge with the Persians, whose empire included most of what is now Turkey, other than Greek colonies on the western coast. Alcibiades was received favourably by the Persian satrap of western Anatolia. His position as an exile from the Greek world to Persia was not unique, and several leading Athenians in decades gone by had sought refuge amongst the Persians after their political careers collapsed at home. For their part, the Persians were always anxious to have allies who could provide them with information on the Greeks and how best to undermine them in the Aegean Sea. Alcibiades would not have long to try to plot some return to favour in Athens. In 404 BC he was killed near Elpahus, a mountainous district in the Phrygia region. There are conflicting accounts of his death in the ancient sources, with the most likely explanation being that the Spartans plotted to have him killed, fearing that he could become a disruptive figure within the Persian Empire in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. He was in his mid-40s at the time of his death, and certainly not yet 50. The disruptive nature of his action was becoming clear to everyone in Athens by the time Alcibiades was killed, hundreds of kilometres to the east. By 406 BC, when he lost the Battle of Notium, the city of Athens itself was under increasing pressure from the annual attacks on land by the Spartans. When it lost several further battles in the Aegean thereafter, most notably the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC, in the area around where the Battle of Gallipoli would famously be fought 2.5 millennia later, it could no longer keep the city supplied through its port at Piraeus. Thus, in 404 BC, Athens surrendered to Sparta. The Spartans forced the Athenians to dismantle their empire and to get rid of their navy, while also ordering them to tear down their city walls and the walls to the port at Piraeus, ensuring that if they ever went to war with Sparta again, they would be quickly defeated. All of this spelled such unrest in Athens itself that the democratic system temporarily collapsed and a group known as the 30 Tyrants came to power. Meanwhile, Sparta was ascendant as the hegemonic power in the Greek world. It wouldn't last long, though. It too had lost many of its citizen warriors in the war. Further clashes with Persia added to this problem, and as early as 371 BC, the Spartans were in such decline that they were defeated by an alliance led by the city-state of Thebes as a new alliance, the Boeotian League, came to power. Athens would soon recover as a commercial power, but it would never again exercise the sort of imperial power around the Mediterranean which had allowed Alcibiades the demagogue to propose conquering Sicily in the mid-410s BC with such disastrous results.